Welcome back to Kearsarge Valley Magazine. Again, I'm here with Don Wright, and we started our discussions last week and talked a lot about, sort of summarized your life story and introduced your book, Life is a Piece of Cake, which is a wonderful read. I have read part of it. I hope to get through the rest. But today we wanted to talk about your childhood a little bit. Kind of because, you know, flying the U-2 takes a certain kind of person, and not everybody could do that. And I think, you know, let's talk about your childhood. What made you into a man that could handle that kind of a career, an amazing career, but one with some risk. And so tell me a little bit about growing up.
Well, I mentioned earlier that I was born in Buffalo, New York, and my mother had been divorced actually 2 years after I was born, but my father and she had parted company 2 months before I was born. I had a very strong family. My grandpappy was a yard master for the Pennsylvania Railroad. My grandmother was a powerful woman, although very short. Nobody got in her way. And she drove a 36 Oldsmobile with abandon. I had aunts and uncles, and as I grew up, the war began. And I would be ferried from person to person. I lived with aunts, uncles. Grandma was probably lived as much with my grandmother as anybody. My mother was a character. She was, I call her Andy Mame. She loved life. She was quick-witted and I guess I would say ambitious. Now, when I remember her, she was always going to college, or she worked at a bar in Buffalo, New York called Metzger's Bar and Grill, and a couple times we lived over the bar. And she made $21 a month and survived.
Wow.
If she never preached to me about anything that I can remember about ever in my life, but she always felt that we were all born with the ability to know the difference between right and wrong. And if she ever preached anything, that might have been it. And because she was gone so much, I would end up being home not long periods of time, but from time to time. And I could go anywhere I wanted in the city. I just seemed to have a responsible attitude about myself. The threat that for children may have still been there, but it isn't like today.
Right.
There was a comfort level that makes the stories that I tell in here almost sound like she didn't care. But
she had to work.
She had to work, and I would stay with my grandparents in one thing or another as we went through my early years.
You grew strong from that. You had to rely on yourself for a lot.
I did, and I'm not so sure I was the lone ranger in that, but most people had very, very close-knit families. A divorce was unheard of, really.
Right.
I probably was the only kid I knew who was a product of divorce, although it didn't bother me particularly because I had grandparents and uncles, and my grandfather was very important in my life. So I lacked for nothing. But one thing my mother always, she never felt sorry for herself, certainly not for me. We moved often. By the time I was in the second grade, I had been through 11 different schools, and I'll bet you we had moved 15 times by then.
Wow.
I'd come home from school, and there'd be a moving van, and my mother would come out, she says, "Donald, we're going to go and find a new opportunity, and we're going to meet new people."
You said?
Fine.
Okay. It was a way of life.
It was nomadic, and it was fine. I didn't miss the security of a continual home, and I look forward to these things.
Which, you know, probably also made you a very outgoing person, because you had to start all over with meeting friends and...
I was never the most popular kid in the class. I was never the goat. I was shy enough amongst children, but I was very outgoing amongst adults because I was the only child. And I guess you could say people must have doted on me. I mean, they used to enjoy being with me. So
Right.
I thought that I was hot stuff.
So tell us about the farm, because it came to a point where I think your mother went overseas to work for the war effort, or?
Not really. She was, we were in Buffalo at the time, and as soon as the war broke out, everybody in my family went off to war or went to work. My mother became a riveter at Curtis Wright building P-40s. My grandmother was a riveter. My aunt was a runner, all at Curtis Wright. The men, my uncle was a B-25 bombardier. Another uncle fought with MacArthur throughout the whole Pacific campaign. In fact, made a whole career of it. And there was really nobody home to take care of me. I'd go to school and I'd come home and I'd be home for a couple hours, and then they were working overtime and one thing or another. And I could remember my grandmother, my mother, and my aunt all sitting there whispering about me, and I was fine. I didn't think that there was anything unusual. I could handle it. And my mother said one afternoon, just before a weekend, she says, "Donald, we're going to go and find you a place where you can have a home, and not so we don't have to worry about getting back from the plant." And I says, "Well, where are we going?" And she said, "We're going to go out to the farm." And I said, "Well, what farm?" She said, "We haven't found it yet." So we jumped in Grandma's 36 Oldsmobile, and we went to the farm. And I remember going to the first farm where Grandma would go buy eggs. She was very particular at what was fed in her kitchen. She was a fabulous cook. And we went up, knocked on the door, and this large farm lady came, and the barking dogs and a bunch of dirty little kids are all scrambling around. And my grandmother looks up at this lady and says, "My name is Alice McNerney. This is my daughter, Betty Wright, and her son, Donald. We work at the defense plant, and we need to board the boy out. We thought you might be interested. We'll be glad to pay." This woman looked at me and looked at them as if they had a disease. And just shook her head. So we went to the next farm. And we went from farm to farm. It was fun for me. I'd go play with the animals, the dogs, the kids. And it was just a great big adventure as far as I was concerned. Now, Grandmother was a great judge of character, and as was my mother. And I could remember them talking in the car. Sometimes we'd go to a farm and they'd chatter a while. And my grandmother would say, well, we'd like to buy a dozen eggs. She wouldn't even go through her spiel. But if she liked what she saw, then she tried her spiel. We did this 2 or 3 weekends, and I guess they were exasperated. I kind of enjoyed it. I always got an ice cream cone at the end of the day, and it's all you really need when you're going on 8 years old. And we went to one place called Hudson's. It was a Hudson farm in South Wales, New York. And they gave the usual no. They weren't nasty. They just said no. And we turned to leave, and this farm lady said, my cousin, Millard and Maud Hudson, have a farm about a mile from here. It's a 150-acre farm. They don't have children. They're an older farm couple. They might just take the boy in. So we went over there. And we drove up. And here's probably, I call them homely in the best sense of the word, a couple I've ever seen. And Millard had these monster ears. And they were probably in their 50s, mighty old to me. And Maud and Grandma and my mother talked and chatted a while, and it looked like it was good. And I was playing with the dog and then one thing or another, and it was a beautiful farm. And they said, and the Maud finally said, well, no, I don't think this would work. And so we got in the car, and Grandma went up in the barnyard and turned around and was coming back out, and Maud stood there, and she says, leave the boy. We'll give it a try. So they dumped me out with my carpet bag, and, and off they went in a cloud of dust.
Oh my goodness.
And Maud said, well, better come up. We're having dinner, which is noontime. So we went up and we had a great meal, met all the guys. We had Millard, and then there was Judd, the farmhand, and had this wonderful meal. I love to eat. And everything was fresh. And so Maud took me for a tour of the house and the yard, and then the men had gone back out into the fields, and after that I ran down into the fields and hopped on the cutter bar where Millard was cutting behind Prince and Polly, the horses, and Judd was off in another field working with a tractor. And I lived there for 2 years, best years of my life.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that. We're going to break now, but
Okay.
next week, let's finish up that story because you learned a lot during those 2 years.
Indeed.
And then we'll move on to your time with the Air Force.
Okay,
Thanks, Don.
thank you.